Royal wedding anniversaries that end in divorce are not supposed to be marked at all. This year, 13-year-old Prince George marked one anyway. There is no toast, no reissued photograph, no line in the court circular for a marriage that ended the way this one did. Charles and Diana were married at St. Paul's Cathedral 45 years ago this week. Nobody at Kensington Palace had scheduled a statement about it. The date usually passes the way every anniversary of that marriage has passed since 1996. In silence, unmentioned, treated by the family as a private matter that ended badly and stayed that way. Then, the evening before the anniversary, George walked into the Sunken Garden carrying something small enough to close inside one hand. Nobody in the press office approved it. No photographer was there to record it. Nobody watching the statue that week had been told to expect anything at all. He is Diana's eldest grandchild, born almost 16 years after she died. What he brought that evening has a wedding day history far older than either of his parents. And how it reached him, more than what it actually was, is what turned one quiet visit into a story the whole family is now talking about. This isn't just a boy marking a date he had no obligation to know about. It's the family's future king, at 13, choosing on his own to fold his grandmother back into the one royal wedding the palace has spent almost 30 years declining to mention. Charles and Diana's anniversary has never been marked publicly since their divorce. Not with a statement, not with so much as an old photograph reissued for the day. If George's gesture holds, this is the first time in nearly 3 decades that anyone inside Kensington Palace has treated the 29th of July as a date worth remembering, rather than one worth quietly letting pass. What he did that evening in the Sunken Garden is one thing. What it did to his grandfather's composure the following morning, once Charles found out, is another. And by every account, it did not stay off his face for long. The wedding itself needs little introduction. July 29th, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral. What gets left out of the anniversary retellings is smaller, and it is the detail that matters here. Since 1858, every royal bride has carried a sprig of myrtle in her bouquet. The tradition began with Princess Victoria, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, using cuttings from a myrtle bush that still grows today in the grounds of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Diana's sprig in 1981 came from that same original plant. Custom holds that a cutting from each bride's sprig is sent back to Osborne afterward and replanted. So the bush that supplied Charles and Diana's wedding is, in a sense, the same bush that later supplied Catherine's in 2011. Royal historian Hugo Vickers has written that the myrtle tradition is one of the few pieces of wedding ritual to survive, largely unnoticed, into the modern era, overshadowed by tiaras and headlines, but unbroken since Victoria's day, regardless of how any individual marriage turned out. The Sunken Garden at Kensington Palace, where Diana's memorial statue has stood since the summer of 2021, was replanted before the statue's unveiling to reflect the colors of Diana's own wardrobe. By convention, the garden has no connection to the myrtle tradition at all. No ceremonial link, no precedent, nothing written down anywhere that would explain what happened next. That is the gap a 13-year-old is reported to have closed on his own, the evening before his grandparents would have marked 45 years of a marriage that ended before he was ever born. There is no public confirmation of how a sprig of wedding myrtle ended up in a 13-year-old's hands 3 days before an anniversary nobody was supposed to mark. But according to Hello magazine, which first reported the detail, it did not come from Osborne House at all. It came from a cutting kept much closer, inside Kensington Palace's own walled garden, grown from stock descended from the original plant, and normally reserved for family weddings, not memorials. Nobody has explained on the record how a request for it reached the gardening staff, or who signed off on cutting a wedding flower for a garden that has never, in 5 years, hosted one. The request came anyway, and it was granted. The next part is where a gardening story stops being a gardening story. A source close to the household has said George's interest did not begin with the anniversary at all. It began weeks earlier, when he came across a photograph of his grandmother on her wedding day and asked his father what she had been holding. William, according to the same account, did not simply answer the question. He is said to have arranged it himself, involving no equerry, no private secretary, and no press office, so that his son could have a sprig of his own. It was the heir to the throne authorizing, on his own initiative and without telling anyone paid to manage the family's image. The first crack in almost 30 years of official silence about his parents' marriage. What happened next has no official record, only a witness. 2 days later, on the evening of July 28th, with no press notified and no photographer present, George is reported to have walked into the Sunken Garden with a single protection officer and knelt at the base of his grandmother's statue for less than a minute. He did not leave the myrtle on the plinth where flowers are normally left for photographs. He is said to have pressed it into the soil at the statue's feet instead, low enough that a visitor the next morning would need to know exactly where to look to find it. Then he stood, said nothing anyone recorded, and left the way he came. One person did know where to look, and within days, by a route nobody at the palace has explained, the detail reached Hello magazine. What George said, if he said anything at all while he knelt there, has not been repeated by anyone in a position to have heard it. What happened to his grandfather once the detail reached him did not stay private for nearly as long. Charles was told the next morning before his official engagements began. According to a source who spoke to the Daily Mail, he did not say much when he heard it. He asked one question about exactly where at the statue's base the myrtle had been left, and then said nothing else on the subject for the rest of the day. What he did instead was clear one appointment that had been on his diary for weeks, and go to the Sunken Garden himself, alone except for a single protection officer, on the morning of July 29th. That sounds small, a king standing by a statue for a few minutes before breakfast. It wasn't. Charles has never been photographed at his former wife's memorial since it was unveiled in 2021. Not on an anniversary, not on her birthday, not once in 5 years. Camilla was not there. No statement was issued. No court photographer had been briefed because none had been told to come. The only record of the visit at all came from staff who happened to be tending the same garden that had supplied the myrtle 3 days before and who described a man standing still for longer than the visit strictly required, his hands in his coat pockets, looking down at a patch of soil rather than up at the statue itself. This is where a marriage the palace spent almost 30 years declining to discuss finally gets acknowledged, in its own understated way, by the two people who lived it and the one who never got the chance to. William answered his son's question about a photograph. George turned that answer into a gesture at a statue. And Charles, the following morning, appears to have gone to say something no one recorded to a woman he married 45 years ago, divorced 15 years into it, and lost roughly a year after that. Nothing about it looks coordinated, and that is precisely what makes it hold together. George's request started with a photograph, not an instruction. William's help started with a father answering a question, not a plan drawn up by anyone paid to manage the family's image. Charles's visit came a full day after the fact. Once he already knew what had happened without him, and once there was nothing left for him to arrange, only somewhere to stand. 3 people, a generation apart, arriving separately at roughly the same instinct. None of them waiting for the other 2 to go first. What this ordinary Wednesday actually did was quietly restore a date the family had let go dark for almost 3 decades. Royal wedding anniversaries are not, as a rule, occasions the palace marks once a marriage has ended. And this one had ended twice over, first in divorce, then in something nothing could undo. There was never an obligation for anyone to remember July 29th at all. That a 13-year-old chose to anyway, without being asked, says something about how the next reign may end up holding Diana's memory. Not through renamed gardens or official portraits, but through small, specific gestures a child decides on his own are worth doing. It suggests the family's relationship with this particular date was never really resolved by 3 decades of silence. It was only paused, waiting for someone young enough not to know he wasn't supposed to mark it. Diana chose a sprig of myrtle for her own wedding at 20, from a bush she likely never thought about again. 45 years later, her grandson chose the same flower, from the same lineage, for a garden built to remember her instead.